Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you are in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us for this report launch of two key reports on the French-UK border. The first is a report by Pierre Bonnevalle, who's a political scientist, and whose report, investigation into 30 years of the border, looks at 30 years of bilateral agreements between the UK and France in the shaping of a securitized and highly militarized border between the UK and France. The second report is by Martin Lotto, an anthropologist, and is called On the Border, and collects the experiences and surveys the experiences of people stuck at the border in the north of France. Both were published last year by the Plateforme des Soutiens aux Migrants, which is a member of the Crossborder Forum. And through the Crossborder Forum, with the support of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, we were able to translate these from their original French into English to mark 20 years since the Touquet agreements were signed between France and the UK in 2003. So before we go into the presentations, I'll just give a bit more context about the French-UK border and also about the work of the Cross-Border Forum. So these reports found that since 1998, 1.2 billion euros have been spent on enforcing the UK-France border, and the situation for people on the move or exiled people has only worsened. So for example, since the signing of the treaty in 2003, over 300 people have died at the border. And UK spending commitments from 2014 to present have, in total, £232 million have been spent through these successive agreements between the French and UK government, all in the hopes of enforcing the border, preventing migration from the north of France to the UK. And so that's why it was really important for us to have these reports translated from French into English, because obviously these are bilateral agreements, and so both states are jointly responsible for the state of violence, harassment, and just inhumanity that we're seeing at the border in the north of France. And I think it's really important to be able to connect the hostile environment that's created in the north of France against people on the move, and then the hostile environment that's being implemented in the UK through immigration policy here. So I'll just, I should have done this earlier, but I'm just going to share my screen briefly to show you the geography of the north of France, because I think if you aren't familiar with the different areas and with the different places where people lived, it can be a bit confusing to understand the different locations. So these are all of the different living spaces that exist before the before 2014, 2016, where all of the living spaces were dismantled by the French government, to give you an idea of the geography. So I'm now going to pass over to Clara, who's the coordinator from the Plateforme des Soutiens aux Migrants, and she will be talking to you about the work that the PSM does, the context in which the reports were commissioned, and Marta's reports.
Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello to all. Thank you very much, Francesca, for organizing this, and thank you very much also for the translation. Thank you. My name is Clara Ouin. I am a coordinator in the PSM, the Plateforme de Soutien aux Migrants. We are a network of different organizations that are solidar with the people who are blocked at the French-British border. Now, This means that we are working together with the various players at the border level, and we know that a lot of the people present there at the border on the coast have problems to actually make it clear what is taking place, and this despite the different measures which have been taken. We're talking about a great number of measures which have been taken so far, letters to the authorities or symbolic actions, legal appeals. And in fact, we noticed that there is a total dismissal of the case by the authorities. So since January 2020, we have set up an inter-associative working group at the border level. It's called the Advocacy Commission. The idea is to share an analysis of the issues and difficulties at the border. And the aim is also from there to try and define a better balance of power in the medium and long term, and thus to try and move the lines. The so-called advocacy committee or commission has not developed a campaign plan as such, but a methodology implying a real change of attitude or posture has been developed. And we have developed, with the help of two research workers like Pierre Bonnevalle, developed actually some reports. Pierre Bonnevalle, who is present or has been present for the past 30 years. So we have this analysis of 30 years of public policy on the French-British border by this political scientist, Pierre Bonnevalle. And then we will also have some information about a survey of exiled persons which are blocked at the border, and this has been conducted by Marta Lotto, anthropologist. And the idea is to establish some possibility for dialogue at the border level. And over the past years, local groups in Calais, but also in Grande-Sainte and Ouistreham, have been set up in order to submit these written productions for discussion with a variety of local actors. The aim of this consultation work is to gather the support of local people in order to set up real citizen coalitions. Now, these two reports have been published a year ago on the 4th of February 2022. And thanks to the Crossborder Forum, these reports have been translated into English and are available in the UK. And we hope that this will lead to more exchanges among citizens at the UK level. So this is just to give you an idea of those reports, the important. Unfortunately, Marta Dotto, the anthropologist, was not available today to share some of the results or the testimonies which were gathered during the survey. The survey was launched during the first half of 2021. It is the result of 59 interviews conducted in 22 places inhabited by people who are in transit at the French border with the UK. So we're going from Caen to Grande-Sainte via Calais, Ouistreham, Cherbourg, Saint-Hilaire-Côte, Ranville, and Islay. The people that were met are essentially men, some families, mainly from Pakistan, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Iraqi Kurdistan, but also West Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Albania, and Iran. So let me also add there are a large number of minors as well. These exchanges have focused on their living conditions and on the difficulties encountered by the people interviewed. The aim is to understand the singular stories and trajectories or paths for each of them, a shared experience. What is life at the border? What about legal crossings, which they are denied? Most people who were interviewed had in common that they have been living outside in informal settlements. Two-thirds of them explained that they had been forced to sleep without the protection of a tent for at least one day since their arrival, despite the difficult weather conditions, either because when they had just arrived they had no tent, or the tent was confiscated by the police or stolen, or because they were sharing it with friends and there was not enough room for everyone. People interviewed largely denounced the eviction of their living quarters. 77% of them also denounce a confiscation or degradation of their personal belongings, such as their tents, but also souvenirs, telephones, administrative papers, glasses, or even medicines. This is the case of Rafik, who, when he knew the police was carrying out an eviction in the place, ran back to the camp. I quote what he says: "I arrived too late and the police did not let me enter the jungle. They told me to wait for 2 hours and my things were no longer there." This is also the case of Aden, who says, "I saw my tent being burned." In the case of Osman, he tells us they came, they tore, they burned the tents, no possibility of recovering the stuff in the tents. And Bihar witnesses in saying, "I was in my tent when the police tore it. I was still inside." These policies have an impact on people's daily survival. Each time there is a seizure or destruction operation, they have to find a shelter and belongings to protect themselves. This is the case of Ibrahim, a father of 2 children aged 5 and 8, who told how difficult it was to find food during eviction. I quote him, "When there is an eviction, the children don't eat until the evening." Faced with the daily evictions, people described a variety of feelings and thoughts. 39% of the people interviewed by Marta said they were angry, 24% were felt, a lot had shocks, disappointment, fear, others felt humiliated. Above all, people shared their resignation, disgust, unease, and the difficulty of coping with this situation and living with a sense of constant alertness. Tarek told us about the too many times the police evicted his place of living. I quote, "They arrive in the morning, they shout to wake us up, they hit the tents, tear them down, they jump on the tents while people are inside." Lewar shared his feelings of sadness. I quote, "It's sad and hard. The police don't see us humans. It makes us sad." For instance, during the last eviction, some people managed to get their things back, others didn't, and they watched the police tearing their things apart in front of them. End of quote. For some people, the expulsion or eviction was accompanied by forced sheltering, i.e., they were taken by bus to so-called CAES, or emergency accommodation facilities with the use of public force, and often far from the north of France. Ahmed, aged 17, told us, "They arrived very, very early. We were still sleeping. They confiscated our belongings and they took us very far away to a hotel. The next day we returned to Calais. We were really far away. The next time when they started to evict us, I ran to avoid being taken away very far away." The testimonies of the interviewees were unequivocal. They had no idea where the buses were going to take them at the time of these forced sheltering, and that was a waste of time for all of them. Among the reasons why they do not want to go, they mention the distance from the coast and the desire not to apply for asylum in France, or the impossibility of doing so. 48% of the respondents underlined a lack of information and understanding of how the centers work. Many do not know about the centers. No one has presented them with their role and location. In addition, there was a fear that the police would gain access to these centers, which reinforced the choice to stay away from them. The main wish that emerges from these exchanges between Martha, the anthropologist, and the people is to be able to find a dignified place to live. The demand is to find shelter without being constantly chased and harassed by the authorities. One respondent expressed his anger and repeatedly stating that he did not hate Europe, but the European policies, and I quote him, "This system is made for you to waste time, your hopes, your best years. It's so unfair. We are seen as criminals. We're treated like dogs. There are now elections coming up and they make us leave more. The police come and check us almost on a daily basis. It's their way of sending the message that they don't want us. It's not human. Let them tell me where I can go to live with dignity. They don't know where we can go either. Nobody wants us. We're paying too much. Why is it? Why? Why can't we stay anywhere in Europe?" Finally, and this is not an excerpt of Marta Loto's report, but it's another extract witnessing what is actually taking place. It was written by Ahmed following the devil's friend in October 2021. I quote, "Fear and anxiety, strikes and intimidation, violence and repression, provocation and humiliation, deprivation and injustice, neglect and invisibility, oppression and concealment, all this suffering, we experience it day and night here in France, especially in the city of Calais. We sleep in fear in a small tent that can barely hold one person, and yet the forces of law and others do not let us rest in peace even for one night. And the forces, their violence continues well beyond that. They deprive us of food using several ways of inhuman deprivation. They hinder the help and relief provided by associations on practically all areas of the Calais town, even though this does not hinder public traffic. So all the places in Calais are forbidden to sleep, eat, drink. So the question we are asking ourselves is, what is the appropriate or authorized place in Calais for an exile to eat, drink, and sleep? Is this the humanity you claim and proclaim? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Clara. That was really powerful, and thank you for sharing those testimonies from Marta's report and also the approach that PSM had in commissioning the two reports. So for anyone who has joined us in between the presentations, we have interpretation enabled. You can select the language channel of your choice, English and French, by going to the bar at the bottom. Next, we'll have Pierre Bonnevalle, who will be speaking about his report. And after Pierre, Caitlin from JCWI will be offering a UK perspective on the situation and drawing that connection across the border. I also did forget to present myself and introduce myself. So I'm Francesca, I'm the Crossborder Forum coordinator. I'm based in London, and the Crossborder Forum is a space for civil society organizations interested in the UK-France-Belgium border to exchange information, expertise, and work collaboratively towards shared advocacy and action on ongoing cross-border migration and asylum issues. We have over 40 members, which range from direct support organizations for people on the move in northern France, like the Plateforme des Soutiens aux Migrants, to national migrants' rights organizations in the UK, France, and Belgium, including, for example, JCWI and other people who are present on this call. So I will now pass it over to Pierre, who will talk about his report before we move on to Caitlin after.
Merci beaucoup, Francesca, pour
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Francesca, for having organized this meeting and for having gathered so many people. That's really great. And thank you very much for Clara for having described so well the situation, because of course now I can take the time to try to explain to you exactly how we got here and perhaps see together how long it's been that these people, these exiled people, have been going through this. So let me introduce myself. As Francesca said, I am a researcher in political science. I'm also a journalist, and I used to work on those issues in the past already. So then when the PSM asked me to draft this report, of course, it was easy for me now. Of course, now we launched the report in English. Of course, I drafted it in French and I presented it last year. So the report covers 30 years of public policies on migrants at the Franco-British border. The idea of this research is to really decipher how the policy of deterrence that's been in place at this border, how it's been established, under which form. And when I talk about deterrence, I talk about harassment, internment, expulsion, daily evictions, for instance, deprivation, no access to water, to food, to shelter, although it's an obligation or a right for these people. And for the exiled people, these rights do not exist apparently. So the idea is to indeed organize systematically the lack of access to a a legal status. So this is absolutely not a new policy. It's been going on ever since the 90s, with an increase ever since the closure of the Sangatte camp in 2002, and especially as of the Touquet agreements that were signed 20 years ago, this policy has been reinforced. So in 20 years, we've seen that this deterrence policy has just gaining ground, and the climax was the end of 2016 with the destruction of the Calais shanty town, the jungle. So it's been an industrialized policy of expulsion with indeed 3 expulsions per week, now going to almost daily expulsions in recent months. So you've got Human Rights Observers, which is an organization working in Grande-Sainte or in Calais. In 2022, this association saw that there was 1,610 expulsions in 2022 in Calais, only in Calais. So that means humiliation, daily harassment for these people, as described by Clara. And this deterrence policy that I was able to describe is the direct result of 21 Franco-British agreements that have been signed over a period of more than 40 years, and the establishment of a very close Schengen area, which is basically based on security and making sure that there's security policy around those people, around us exiled people. The aim is very clear: make sure that exiled people are do not stay on the coast, make sure that they do not cross the channel to the British territory. So I just wanted to perhaps set the background. So let's get into details. Let's see a little bit the history of this policy. Already in the 90s, we found exiled people in Calais, people coming from Eastern Europe, for instance. So already in the 90s, you can find people that cannot move from the harbors of Calais, for instance. They cannot move there because they don't get the permits to cross over to Britain, or because they've already been expulsed by the British authorities, or they've been sent back to France. Now, when we see the number of people, of refugees, of migrants at the end of the 90s, well, you will remember that back then we tried to find a solution by establishing the Sangatte camp, a sort of a semi-humanitarian security camp. But then came Nicolas Sarkozy as Ministry of the Interior in France, who closed Sangatte and launched almost daily eviction policies to make sure that those exiled people could be sent back, driven back elsewhere, not in the north, in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, but more in the south of France, for instance. The idea being, let's send them elsewhere, far from the border, from the Franco-British border. And this harassment policy, this eviction policy that was implemented was directly linked to the Franco-British agreements, for instance, the Touquet agreement, because these Touquet agreements basically put the border on French territory. So France and the CDH in its report said that France became the armed force of the British, the mission of which was to make sure that migrants do not cross over to Britain. So we stayed on this agreement. There have been other agreements in between, but this is like the ground zero of the policy. And of course, on the other hand, you've got a bunkerization, a securization of the border, militarization of the border with barbed wire and other types of technology. I'll talk about it later on. But of course, all those people stayed there. They were still trying to get over to Britain. In 2014, jump in time now, in 2014, again, you would find a lot of exiled people on the coast. So there was quite an increase of migrants. And for instance, this resulted in the creation of the Calais shantytown, or what we call the Calais jungle in 2015, or the Linière camp in Grande-Sainte, a little further up north in 2016. And so a little bit like in the Sangat camp, so you've got, again, here, half humanitarian, half security emergency camps. So the idea is to concentrate people in one location, make sure that they are not in city centers, make them invisible, while allowing British authorities to finance new security infrastructures, because, again, the priority is to make sure that they do not cross over the channel. In 2016, those two camps were closed down. And again, there are new Franco-British agreements that are being signed, new British subsidies in order to finance a policy that we call the anti-fixation point policy, with an industrialization of the policy. A couple of examples. When we talk about expulsions and evictions, we're talking here about the destruction of the camps with the detention of those people who survived the camps, in the camps. So in 2018, we had 452 eviction operation. 2021, 1,226. In 2022, 1,670. You have to imagine the energy that you need on behalf of the police, the enforcement forces. Every time they drive people away, those people are driven away, but they come back and they, of course, build new camps. In 2020, so we have an investigation report that allowed us to have a research, a study rather, that allows us to have this data. So the police were mobilized, and the setting up of the camps with the police, it was we're talking here about 100 million pounds. That is the cost. That is what is invested so as to make sure that people are not left in peace only in Calais, only in Calais. So in light of everything that's happening, what I try to do is to find some sense to it all. It's not obvious, but perhaps we could think about why do the British and the French governments go on with this policy, whereas people are still there. So on the basis of the interviews that I carried out, but also the existing literature, there are, let's say, 4 pillars that are really the foundation of this industrialization policy of evictions. First of all, what we call the creation of a hostile environment. Indeed, most of the people that are living on the coastlines, they cannot be legally removed because they are fleeing war, authoritarian regimes, or because they are minorities and their lives are at risk in their own countries. And so the French state, by deploying a deterrence policy through harassments, evictions, is trying to create an environment that is sufficiently hostile so that people evict themselves. So if people cannot go away, if we cannot make them go away, if we cannot drive them away, let's make sure that they drive themselves away. That's the policy. That's the French policy. And in fact, the Minister of the Interior, Gérard Collomb, in 2017, really took the responsibility for this responsibility, because he said on this policy that the idea is we will make them not want to come to us. And he said it just like that. The idea of a hostile environment was also developed by Theresa May in 2012. In an interview to the Telegraph, she said that her aim was, and I quote, to create a hostile environment in Britain for illegal migration. So we go back to the idea of benchmarking and how states are copying one another, copying and paste their policies. So that's the first rationale, the first, let's say, pillar. Second rationale, and again, is something that the Ministry of the Interior is defending, is fighting, against any point of attachment, so to speak. So you create an in-draft, so to speak. The idea is, well, if you receive these people, if you welcome these people too well, they'll come in droves. And we trace the history of this theory. It was first, of course, a discourse of the extreme right, the right wing, and then it became, the discourse, the normal narrative of the political parties. Now, the facts do not support this theory, but it is the main foundation of the public policy that is being implemented today. So, for me, this is a myth of public action, which prevents us from conceiving some sort of alternative, any desire for instance, local elected officials to set up some kind of alternative solution. Now, Natasha Bouchard, who's the mayor of Calais, said a couple of years ago, in fact, that Britain had to change its policy in terms of migration and in terms of shelter that it gives to people, because the British authorities have created an in-draft. It's really attracting those migrants because it's too nice to the migrants. Third pillar is the strength of the states. So it's a narrative that is built on the way the situation is perceived externally. In 2002, when Nicolas Sarkozy was the minister of the interior, and he closed the Sangatte camp, he declared that he was putting an end to this draft. Yeah, but we saw that the closure of the camp did not prevent people from coming to the coastline. But what did he do next to that? Well, he deployed a eviction harassment policy, the idea being to, make sure drive people away, and you drive them away for a couple of days, but then they come back, of course. François Hollande, the French president in 2016, said when he destroyed the Calais jungle, as we call it, the shantytown in Calais, he said, and I quote, "France is not a country where we will find camps." But because, of course, migrants were returning to the coast, just like Nicolas Sarkozy, he renewed the policy of harassment and deterrence, as if the state had some kind of mandate, an execution mandate in the field to drive people away. And these measures are a sort of it's like a theater stage. You sort of show to the world that the state has the capacity, the strength to manage its border, its territory, although the border has been externalized, to make sure that everybody knows that the state knows exactly what it's doing, that it can manage the problem. Yes, but the problem is that you're starting all over again every other day. And of course, you've got this industrialization of evictions. Now, of course, it's very violent towards people, but it's also, of course, a violation of the law governing evictions and expulsions. So now the justice system do not even bother to officially launch operations, because that would mean that you have to notify people, you respect certain principles, etc. And of course, on the shores, this is a permanent violation of the law. The public prosecutor actually said that, we've been dismantling those camps because we invite people to leave the premises. What an invitation. Basically, here we're mobilizing public monies, British and French, to really make sure that you evict people. These expulsions, and as Clara said before in her presentation, have very concrete effects. They're really making the lives of those exiled people very, very hard. Their living conditions are extremely dire. Now, these people are driven away from the coast. They try to, of course, cross over to Britain at the risk of their lives. You'll remember that in 2021, 27 migrants died because, of course, their boat just sank while they were trying to cross over to Britain. And of course, these crossings of the channels on a boat have been well documented in the last couple of years. Now, of course, this is in response to a crisis that's been created by the British and the French government. Of course, when you see boats crossing over, these crossings are much more visible. And ever since 1984 in the Canterbury Treaty, the governments have tried to make those crossings invisible. Now, ever since the Canterbury Treaty, so there have been like 21 treaties that have been signed between the two countries. You've got, of course, the Touquet Treaty in 2003, which moves the English border to the French territory. In 2016, you've got the Theresa May and Bernard Cazeneuve Treaty with a co-management of the border. And more recently, in 2018, the Sandhurst Treaty. And of course, in addition to these treaties, you've got declarations, agreements, monies flowing to and fro. So there are indeed a lot of things going on between the governments to co-manage this border. This is a political dogma. It's a border that cannot be, let's say, understood in any other manner than through a security rationale, a coercive rationale. The idea is to close down the border by repression, but we always find the same words, the same solutions that are being put forward. And I believe that it was the Sandhurst Treaty in 2018 that it says in its preambles, says that the former agreements have been a failure, but it still goes or follows the same path. So the Sandhurst Treaty says, basically, the agreements before are a failure, but will go on. And let me quote here a legal advisor here says, who says the migration phenomenon has led to repression. As ineffectively as it's been, the migration phenomenon has increased, repression has increased ineffectively, and again, the phenomenon went on and on and on. So each new treaty is an opportunity to stage a closure of a camp, deploy new devices, barbed wire, cameras, scanners, checkpoints, or recently drones. Now, if you look at the different equipment and devices, I've tried to come up with a number, how much that costs, because it all costs a lot of money. Ever since 2098, in less than 25 years, we have spent 1.26 billion euros just spent to protect the entire Franco-British border. That's just, of course, the devices. That's also the infrastructure costs. But I mean, what happens is instead of putting an end to crossings, it just makes them slower. And of course, it means that people are waiting for longer on the coast, at the border. It makes it more dangerous for them to try to cross over. And another number, if you allow me, because of this border, since 1998, more than 356 people, very precisely, have died because of this Franco-British border that both governments want to protect. And in spite of all the risks, people continue to cross, especially in small boats, as we've seen lately. And even the French and British politicians are now taking even more inconsistent policies. In the summer of 2021, Gérald Darmanin, who's the Minister of the Interior in France, asked Frontex to intervene in the channel to prevent migrants from leaving the Schengen area to go to cross over to Britain. At the same time, Frontex is preventing, of course, the migrants or exiled people from entering the Schengen area in the Mediterranean Sea. So a migrant cannot come to Europe by going through Greece, but it cannot leave the EU by crossing the channel. How absurd. Now, as I say, this is a policy that aims to create a hostile environment. The idea is to empty Calais. You can see it if you come to Calais. Now, this policy has absolutely no effect on the number of people that are living on the coast. Ever since the late 90s, and with the exception of the period 2014-2016, there's always been between 1,000 and 2,500 people on the coast. But the effect on the people, on these people, is all the more violent. Physical fatigue, precariousness, difficulty to find food, to wash, to find shelter, to survive. And so the daily life of these exiled people is hampered by public authorities. These public authorities are depriving them from enjoying their fundamental rights. They prevent them from staying in France. They prevent them from staying on the coastline. They also prevent them from crossing to Britain. In Calais, as in Grande-Sainte, in Dieppe, in Cherbourg, in Ouistreham, in Nord-en-Fonte, in all these cities that you've seen on the map shown by Francesca at the beginning of our conference, in all these cities, the state has made exiled people the hostages of its policy of non-shelter. The state has made them non-citizens that are relegated and confined in a lawless zone. And at the same time, Britain turns a blind eye, allows France to carry out this policy, carried out on its behalf, and finances it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci. Thank you very much, Pierre, for that presentation and for synthesizing so clearly the findings of your report and the sort of accumulation of agreements that have led to the situation that we have now on the ground. I'm now happy to pass over to Caitlin Boswell from JCWI, who will be talking about the British perspective on these reports and on these agreements.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much to both speakers so far. My name's Caitlin and I'm Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Yeah, just wanted to say a big thank you to both Pierre and Marta for writing these important and very timely reports, which come in the wake of new deals between the UK and France to further securitise the border, as we've heard, but also the ramping up of surveillance and criminalisation of migrants within the UK under the Nationality and Borders Act and the Prime Minister's recent announcement to make it even harder for people crossing the Channel to live safely in the UK. I think this conversation is extremely needed and that there's still a real lack of awareness and understanding among the British public and even among many of us in the migrant sector about the externalised border and the extent to which the UK offshores its responsibilities to people on the move. So as Francesca said, I'm going to talk about something that Pierre touched on in terms of this kind of hostile environment that we're seeing on both sides of the Channel, and with kind of more focus on how that operates in the UK. So I think what's really, really clear from these reports is that borders are not just at the edges of our national territories, at airports or at kind of shipping docks. And in the case of the UK, our border is not even, is externalised not just onto French soil, but throughout all aspects of public life, where ordinary people such as teachers, healthcare professionals and landlords are turned into border guards via the government's hostile environment. Apologies to UK organisations for whom this may all be very familiar, but I think it's important to touch on in this context. And as many people here will know, and as Pierre mentioned, the hostile environment, now formerly known as the compliant environment, is a set of policies that was introduced in 2012 by the Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, which had the aim of making life in the UK impossible for people without the right papers. And to achieve this, the government set about cutting undocumented people off from using fundamental services, including the NHS and state supports, making it illegal to work or for a landlord to rent them a property. The Home Office also accesses the data public sector organisations use. So whether you're a patient checking, speaking to a GP, or a victim reporting a crime, or an exploited worker reporting your boss, your data can be checked by immigration enforcement. And very unsurprisingly, these measures turn us against each other. Their impacts are far-reaching and life-ruining and felt far beyond just undocumented people. They discriminate against all migrants as well as Black and brown British people, most famously seen with the Windrush scandal. Despite this and the fact that the hostile environment policies have been proven to not even succeed by their own kind of horrendous standards, we are seeing in the UK a massive ramping up of hostile immigration policies over the past year, including mass invasive surveillance and criminalisation of migrant communities, as well as further militarisation of the border. So the Nationality and Borders Act, which came into force in summer last year, introduces a sweeping range of laws which will and are causing devastation to the lives of people seeking refuge and represents a fundamental challenge to the principle of refugee protection in the UK. And it's hard to say whether we can actually claim that we do follow the Refugee Convention anymore with this act in force. I would argue that we can't. And amongst other things, this act will further criminalize migrants. So cracking down on people who steer the small boats across the channel, increasing the maximum sentence for entering the UK irregularly or overstaying your visa to 4 years imprisonment, which essentially makes it a criminal offence to simply exist as an undocumented person, and draconian age assessment tactics, which health professionals and social workers have strongly opposed as unethical, harmful, and as well as being inaccurate. We've seen an increase in electronic tagging used on people on immigration bail facing deportation, which became a duty in August 2021, which is a really frightening policy that's been described by lawyers and charities as a form of psychological torture. And as others have kind of already mentioned, in November last year, the UK and France signed their most recent deal, in which the UK agreed to provide £62 million to further militarise the border through funding patrols along the French coast to prevent people crossing the channel in small boats. This is, as we've heard today, a tried and tested approach, which has been shown time and time again to fail, and comes exactly a year after the largest number of deaths in the channel. So it simply amounts to more state-funded violence and more tragic deaths. As well as this, the Prime Minister announced recent plans to ramp up the hostile environment, which I'm sure came as a shock to lots of us working in the sector who are very aware that the hostile environment has not gone anywhere, but he wants to ramp it up further through increasing immigration raids on workplaces by 50% this year and reintroducing checks to migrants' bank accounts, as well as promising to make it even harder for people who enter the UK irregularly to claim asylum through removing appeal rights and the ability to make late claims, amongst other things. So this is all in the context of a background in which the government has shut off almost all safe routes to the UK, so people simply have no other choice but to take these dangerous journeys. They closed the Syrian resettlement scheme last year, the DUB scheme for unaccompanied children, narrowed family reunion routes, stalled the Afghan resettlement schemes to the extent that last year JCWI revealed that only 4 people had been settled at the time through that scheme, which is a ridiculous number, and the government has also refused to open new ones for the majority of people seeking safety. This then, of course, makes these claims harder for the Home Office to process, adding to the massive backlog and the massively long periods of time that people are being forced to wait in limbo and destitution. So to kind of conclude on this, I'm not going to speak for as long as the other two, because I think, yeah, the main focus of today is on the reports and on the situation within France. But yeah, I would just reiterate that there really isn't enough awareness in the UK of what's going on in France and how we are fueling and funding the situation there. For many people, seeing what's happening in northern France will just think, oh, it's not our problem, and not realise how much we are responsible for that and should be responsible for that. So I'm really hoping that this can be kind of the start of an increasing understanding within the UK of the realities of the hostile environment that exists on both sides of the border. And we would just say that we need this government to really urgently transform the asylum system or the whole immigration system from one defined by cruelty, delay and uncertainty to one which treats people with humanity and compassion. To do this, we need the UK to immediately scrap the Nationality and Borders Act and reinstate the right to asylum, regardless of where a person travels from and how they arrive in the UK. The UK and France must scrap these harmful existing treaties and work together to establish safe routes so people can come here safely. We need properly functioning resettlement schemes that don't prioritise some countries above others. What we need wider family reunion routes and efficient and fair decision making, as alongside the right for asylum seekers to work and access safe and decent housing while they're here and while they wait for their decision to be made. I'm going to stop there, so we've got plenty of time for questions. But yeah, thanks again to the other speakers.
Thank you, Caitlin, Clara, and Pierre, for all of your really helpful presentations and for allowing us to connect the dots between the situation in France and in the UK. I think it's so important for us to have these spaces, which are spaces that, you know, as the Cross-Border Forum, we are trying to open up and establish more for us to exchange across the border and connect those things, because as these presentations have shown us, it's not a French problem, it's not a France problem, it's a UK problem and a French problem together. And I think it's also important for us to sustain this kind of engagement and collaboration and even solidarity building across the border, because we can't, I think it's important to not be just reacting to when there are deaths in the channel, or when, for example, in 2019, where 39 Vietnamese people were found in a lorry in Essex. I think a lot of organizing and a lot of awareness raising springs up in reaction to that. But in the north of France, that violence is happening on a weekly, if not daily basis. So it's important for us to keep having these conversations in the hopes of preventing future tragedy at the border.